Hi, this is F. Paul Driscoll with another episode of Opera News' Sightlines. My guest today is stage director Barrie Kosky, who is celebrated throughout the opera world for his work in opera and throughout the theater world for his work in theater. He has a new production of Fiddler on the Roof, coming from the Komische Oper in Berlin to Lyric Opera of Chicago, and it opens there on September 17th. Welcome, Barrie.
Thank you very much,
Paul.
Pleasure
for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay. Can we begin at the beginning? You seem to have started off more or less with theater productions and then moved on to opera. How did opera attract you at the beginning?
Yes and no, actually, because I actually simultaneously started directing opera when I started my career and actually balanced, sort of juggled then theater and opera. I actually directed my first opera when I was 19.
Good for you.
Melbourne, Australia. So opera has always been part of my life. I've spoken about quite often in interviews and in actual books about the influence my Hungarian grandmother had on me. She was born in Budapest and she came out to Australia in the mid-30s to marry my Russian grandfather. And she was an opera addict through her father, my great-grandfather in Budapest. And she took me to see my first opera when I was 7. And subsequently, I became quite, I would say, more than enamored, quite obsessed by it. And then was taken basically by my grandmother till when I left school. So it was about, sort of 10, 12 years really of going to the opera with my grandmother and seeing over 200 operas before I went to university. So I was very, very lucky and made a few trips with my father because he was in the fur trade and he had to go overseas 4 times a year. So I traveled 3 times with him and my family to see opera in Europe and America. So I had a very unusual opera education for an Australian boy because I was inundated with it from recordings and performances, and also got to see performances in Europe and America. So by the time I got to Europe, I was actually more educated and more and had a greater knowledge of opera than most of my contemporaries, I would say.
Another thing that sets you apart a little bit from some of your contemporaries as directors is that you play the piano and you have musical training, which a lot of stage directors in opera don't. Thank you for saying that when I couldn't. But how do you begin? Do you begin with a score when you're working on an opera?
Yes, always with a score. I mean, I was not just inundated in opera. I learned the piano. I learned the cello when I was at school. I loved going to symphony concerts. I loved playing the piano, certainly not at a concert pianist level, but I still do occasionally play and accompany. But for me, I like to use the word music theater rather than opera. It's the old Walter Felsenstein term, which he sort of used from the early 50s on, in that, opera is really a marriage of music and theater. However, I do believe that the structure of a production and the work on a production must be how text and narrative and character is manipulated and transformed through music, which means that for me, the beginning point is always music. Now, I say that because then I go, of course, in the rehearsal room, you're also looking at text and the singers are articulating text. That's very, very important. And that what differentiates opera from, say, symphonic music. But I think that the great operas and the great opera composers provide you a roadmap with their score. And you have to understand. It would be impossible for me to direct an opera if I didn't understand the architecture of the music and the score, and I didn't understand the landscape, the oral landscape that the composer was constructing, which means you have to take it apart, which means you have to actually know it. I mean, if you don't really get to design a building if you haven't studied architecture,
right.
And you don't get to work in a 3-star Michelin restaurant if you haven't really studied the basics of cooking. And it boggles my mind in opera how so many stage directors do not know anything about music. And to me, it's a great problem in the opera world. But for me, that's not a problem, because for me, I can do that technically.
Something that you've spoken about in other interviews, and I don't want to misquote you, but the fact that the standard repertory, a lot of it coming from the 19th century, which is an era, I should say, which is quite misogynistic, and that contemporary opera producers and directors and companies have to deal with that misogyny. Can you talk about that a little bit? And I'm not saying that it's your responsibility to solve the problem, but how did you?
I know, and I think there are a lot of male and female directors who have relooked at 19th century operas and given it a wonderfully fresh perspective without changing one single note or one single word. And I think it is possible. However, I think that, personally, the 19th century, with exceptions, is not really an area of opera that I've spent a lot of time. I don't direct bel canto. I don't direct Donizetti. I don't direct Bellini. I'm only interested in the Rossini comedies, not the Rossini dramas. The large French operas, French 19th century operas don't interest me. I've directed all the Verdis that I need to direct, because I only really love 3 of them. So, for me, I adore Baroque music and I adore Mozart, and then I sort of make a jump with 1 or 2 exceptions into sort of Wagner and then Puccini, and then 20th century. But I think that the problem is that I think that it starts with, I think it started with the combining of nation states and theaters and national identity in the 19th century. And it's embedded in a very complex mixture of sort of colonialism, racism, and misogyny. And that's not to say that all the operas are racist and colonial and misogynistic. That's not to say that at all. But we have to relook at these stories and relook at this. And one of the reasons why I'm not so wild about bel canto operas is because, firstly, the texts are usually terrible, with exceptions. And it's a singer's art. It's a singer's art. It's bel canto. It's about the beauty of the voice, and that an opera can stop for 5 or 6 or 7 minutes for a mad scene or an expression of coloratura that is showing off a voice. A lot of people like that. I don't like that. I'm not particularly interested in that. And I think that there are operas from the 19th century, and really I'm talking about Italian, but let's leave Wagner out of that, because Wagner operas were sort of revolutionary and different from that. If we look at the sort of major 19th century and the sort of early Verdi, it's sort of Bellini and Donizetti and early Verdi and all this, it can still contain great music, but I find the characters very two-dimensional, and they don't have the complexity of Monteverdi and Handel and Rameau, and they don't have the complexity later of Puccini and Richard Strauss and then the 20th century. But, unfortunately, the 19th century repertoire is still the basis of most of the large opera companies and small opera companies in the world. So the repertoire system in these large houses is really defined by 19th century opera. So there's all sorts of challenges in doing that, because, and it's possible, for example, if we look at Carmen, the given historical idea of this femme fatale vamp is sort of unplayable now. It's not interesting. And that's actually not in the Mérimée novel, and it's not in Bizet's score. Carmen is a much more complex character than she's often portrayed on the stage. But I think you can actually, as have a lot of productions done in the last 10 years, come up with a way of portraying Carmen and doing Carmen without changing a note or the music, but actually treating her like a serious character and making Don Jose the problem, not Carmen, which is the piece, because he is the problem. He is the problem. He's this boy man, and he is the psychopath. She's not. She's this free spirit that he destroys. So that's the piece. So that's what you've got to put on stage. Now, a lot of people don't like to see that, because that means you can't sort of bathe the whole thing in a sort of ersatz Spanish kitsch, but it's not the piece. And so, in a way, what we've seen with directors and in the last 20, 30 years is that we can actually liberate a lot of these pieces when the production is good, and make the piece timeless and important for our times. And I think that's a wonderful thing.
You mentioned Walter Felsenstein, who obviously had a very strong connection to the Komisch opera, as you do. And one of the many wonderful things that you did there was take a look at operetta from the first half of the 20th century. How did you come up with the idea to do these pieces by Abraham or Oscar Strauss for contemporary?
Well, I mean, it's very interesting because, I mean, the Komisch opera was started by Walter Felsenstein in 1947 as a sort of laboratory for contemporary music theatre of its time, to try to really bring Stanislavski technique into the opera house. That's essentially what he was doing. And he succeeded brilliantly. He revolutionized opera production from the early 50s. But the Komisch opera theatre was built in 1898 and was actually the leading German-speaking operetta house for up until 1933, the Metropoltheater. And on the stage of the Komisch Oper, we saw the great operetta performers of the 20th century. Richard Tauber was often on the stage, Fritzi Messari, Gitta Alper. These were superstars. They were sometimes more famous than the opera singers. And all the major operetta composers came through the house. So the DNA of the actual theatre contains this music. And people, of course, know Offenbach, the sort of the inventor of European operetta, mid-19th century, and they know Johann Strauss, who took Offenbach's style and reworked it into a very Viennese, the Viennese flavor. And then maybe they know Leha through sort of, Merry Widow, and that's about it. And what people don't realize, there was a whole Berlin chapter of operetta. And this was the operetta mainly from Hungarian Jewish composers who moved from Budapest or Vienna to Berlin at the same time jazz music was starting to hit Europe at the beginning of the 20s. And they combined sort of Hungarian rhythm with Viennese elegance, and then threw in Berlin jazz, and it's a deliciously explosive mix. And this chapter that people really don't know about came to a halt in 1933, which is why people don't know about it, because most of these composers were Jews, and most of these composers either got killed or, in the case of Kalman and Abraham, went to America, but never had the success they had in Europe. And so for me, it was very important to bring back these pieces. Most of the pieces we did in the last 10 years, the Komisch Oper, had not been performed since the 20s and 30s in Berlin. So it was a wonderful project to bring back these pieces in a very large scale, on a major Berlin stage, in a style that was not a nostalgic recreation of this period, but a style that I think captured the spirit of the people. I think what people really don't realize about before the war is that the operetta singers were not opera singers. This is something that happened after the war, when people like Elizabeth Schwarzkopf and Nikolai Gedda and all these wonderful opera singers decided to take a holiday from their opera and record operetta appallingly, in my opinion. And, I agree with you. And in a completely awful way, which had nothing to do with the original. The jazz was taken out. Everything became slow and not ironic and not delicious and delightful and sexy and ironic. And people don't understand that the operetta singers, it was a fach in itself. Yeah. And that fach, unfortunately, has been lost. We don't have that anymore. So I had to find people that could do this, to get actors who could sing, and in a way, the American musical tradition is closer to the Berlin operetta tradition than probably anything else on the planet. So, but we had to find this mix of opera singers and who could do it, and actors who could sing, and we found it, and it was an amazing 10 years of work that we did there.
So, speaking of the American musical, which brings us to Fiddler.
Segueing
segueing very smoothly. I was looking today at statistics, and at the time when Fiddler on the Roof opened on Broadway, 300 performances was considered to be a success. and it ended up running for 3,000. And I think that the other thing I read was that there are approximately 500 amateur or semi-professional performances of it every year. So this is something which is sort of an uber classic, to coin that phrase. I mean, everyone thinks they know Fiddler, and you were able to do a production for the Komische Opera in 2017, I believe, which made people see this in a very different way. And you're now bringing it to an American opera house as opposed to a commercial management. Whose idea was to bring it to Chicago? Was that
it was Anthony's. I mean, I know Anthony Freud for a very long time, and you know, there's been a number of projects that have sort of fallen over that Anthony wanted to bring from Europe, and I wanted to come to Chicago. We've been talking for at least 15 years about all of these things. So, and then he came to see it in Berlin. And was completely bowled over for two reasons. Firstly, because it was performed by an opera company with some non-opera singers in it. That's very essential because the leads were not opera singers. But he saw a very large orchestra. So he heard the score for the first time he'd ever heard the score with 60 musicians in the pit. He saw at the Komische Opera stage 140 people on the stage. I mean, the Statel was 140 people. And he saw what I had tried to do, which to say that the operetta tradition that died in Europe in 1933, really, and Broadway took over that tradition and developed, I think, the sort of book musicals of the 50s, 60s as the next stage of operetta. And so he saw all of those connections and just loved the production and said, this is what, Broadway or the West End cannot do this. We cannot hear these scores were written for large orchestras. Now, Broadway, it's impossible. You've got 12 musicians at the most now playing in a Broadway band. And this does great disservice. I mean, I was in New York a few months ago and saw a preview of Funny Girl, which I think had, 12 or 13 musicians in the pit, where it's actually scored for about 30 musicians, Funny Girl. And it sounded appalling. It sounded absolutely appalling. And it's the same thing with Fiddler. They're like these musicals, also like Rodgers and Hammerstein, they're written for very large orchestras. And it sounds very different when you hear a good orchestra playing the score. And you can see something on a scale that you couldn't. Now, the European opera houses, we can do this because we're almost fully subsidized. So I have a chorus of 60 and I have an orchestra of 100 and I have these things. So, Anthony realized that if he's going to do it, I mean, those musicals, to do those in the lyric opera cost a lot of money. It's a lot of people, particularly since all our casts come from Broadway, because that was my one condition, that I did not want opera singers singing Fiddler on the Roof, because yet again, as I talked about the operetta tradition, it's not, I don't want a famous bass baritone singing Tevye. It's an acting role. It's an acting role. He has to sing it. That being said, the piece belongs on the opera stage, because I believe that those book musicals from the 50s and 60s and pieces like West Side Story and some of the Roger and Hammerstein pieces and Candide from Bernstein and some of the Sondheim musicals, these are pieces that opera houses can do to show how this operetta style developed from the 19th and early 20th century in Europe and then collided with American popular culture, as I think Fiddler is a fabulous example. And here you have a piece which, as you said, is performed by hundreds and hundreds of amateur companies, but performed all over the world. I think in 40 different languages, the musical has been. And on YouTube, you can see people singing it in Hindi, in Pious and Yamukas, or in Japanese. There's a production in Japanese with everyone in Pious and Yamukas. It's fantastic. But I think that this is very much a tribute to the genius of Jerome Robbins too, because it was his idea. And he actually constructed this radical, for its time, Broadway musical.
And for the role of Tevye, I mean, it's Zero Mostel's sort of spirit. Do you think that that's still hovers over it. I mean, he was so...
Well, Zero Mostel for me is someone that you have to go back to. See, I think that the people, I mean, you can see there's little excerpts that we have of Zero Mostel performing it, and you can see what he does is what most Tevyas don't do. And that's certainly not what Topol did, because Zero Mostel has no problem to be unsympathetic sometimes and non-sentimental. Right. So Zero Mostel's genius was to, on one hand, play into this great history of sort of Yiddish clowning. On the other side, to create this sort of, this mixture of sort of a male mother courage, sort of father courage, and a little bit of King Lear and a little bit of the Yiddish clown, and to create something that was completely unsentimental. I mean, there's no musical that contains a character who speaks with God for 3 hours. Mm-hmm. There's no musical. Mm-hmm. And that's what Fiddler on the Roof is. This is a dialogue between Tevye and God, who's sitting out in the audience. And that idea alone is genius. Now, what happened was Topol, who, was responsible for bringing the musical alive to many people through the film, I think created a tradition which I'm not interested in exploring, wasn't exploring in my practice. It's very sentimental. It's very lovable. And I don't think the harshness and the depth is actually there. And so, I mean, I had an amazing actor in Berlin, do it, Max Hopp, who was fantastic. And I had to find not someone like Max Hopp. I'm not interested in doing a photocopy. This is not a Disney musical where everything's the same everywhere around the world. I wanted to find an actor, and that's why we landed with Steven Skarbell, who of course has performed it to great acclaim in Yiddish on Broadway. And he's a fantastic actor. And so when I was auditioning him, I just said, Steve's got to do it. He's absolutely amazing. So it's very important that we try and present a different version of the production. That being said, Paul, it's very truthful. I mean, it's set in 1905. There's no text change, no music change. It's still the show, but we've hopefully swept away a lot of the cliches, and we've made the piece a little bit harder and more uncomfortable where it should be harder and more uncomfortable. And we've also made sure that the piece is a sort of joyous, large-scale music theatre ritual in a way, and not, 20 people, filing on stage singing tradition with it, meant to be a sort of shtetl, which is really what you see now on commercial stages.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but this has been a complete delight for me. I admire your work very much, and I'm hopeful that I will get to Chicago to see it.
Please do. I think it should be great.
So this is F. Paul Driscoll for Sightlines, my very special guest, Barrie Kosky, director extraordinaire. And please, if you're in the Chicago area, see his production, The Fiddler on the Roof, which opens at Lyric Opera Chicago in September. Thank you very much, Barrie.
Thanks, Paul.